a Marxist in philosophy, which is an attempt to revisit Althusser's relation to questions of educational politics. And with us today, apart from Roberto, who teaches at Goldsmiths and is also a member of the Historical Materialism editorial board, we have Giacomo Clemente, who teaches at the University of Milan Bicocca, and who has wrote a book entitled Sapere, Ideologia, Riproduzione, Knowledge, Ideology, Reproduction, can be a rough translation, which is a very important book because it deals with the famous École project, the collective project of the Althusserian group in the 1960s to rethink questions of education, a collective project, most of which has been unpublished, and it's only accessible in the Althusser archives, but which was in a certain way the laboratory out of which some important contributions came, such as Althusser's own manuscript on reproduction and the famous article on ideology and ideological apparatus of the state, but also Baudelot and Establet's book, L'École capitaliste en France, the capitalist school in France, one of the most important Marxist takes on the education system, which is currently being translated by our third presenter, David Bakke from Westchester University, who has also written an important book on Althusser and education, a fresh look on Althusser's writings on education, in particular the on reproduction manuscript, translated in English as On the Reproduction of Capitalism, if I remember correctly, but also who offers, who points to the necessity of a dialogue between Althusser and critical theories of education. So I am Panagiotis Sotiris. I'm an editorial board member of Historical Materialism. I'll be chairing this session and also, contributing with some perhaps comments on this debate. As usual, before we start, we again urge you to subscribe to the journal, Historical Materialism Journal. It's very important that we get this kind of support. We also urge you to see the Historical Materialism book series published by Brill, perhaps currently one of the most important Marxist publishing projects in the Anglophone world. Get your libraries, if you're associated with any institution, to get the books in their first version as Brill editions, which are, of course, rather expensive for individual buyers. But also remember that 1 year after each appearance of a book, these books appear at Haymarket at really affordable prices. So please do look for these books. Now, okay, so this was the introductory part, and we're going, each of the three presenters, Roberto, David, and Giacomo, Roberto, Giacomo, and David, this is the order, are going to have a kind of an introduction, say a few things for about 10, 12, 13, 14 minutes each, and then we're going to have time for discussion. Since you are watching it at a YouTube channel, please use the YouTube channel comments and debate part to make sure that to put your questions there. We're going to see them, read them in the YouTube channel, and then suggest them to our presenters so that they can respond to them. Okay, so yeah. Just apologies, we're just looking at some technical issues.
Okay, I'll just come in here. We are live streaming, but apparently YouTube is not receiving it. So I'm trying to get someone on Haymarket now. So what we might have to do, Panagiotis, is for you to do that introduction again when I can work out why it is that it's not coming up on the screen. I mean, the delay is far too late. So just bear with me. I mean, chat amongst yourselves. You don't have to sit there silently. I'm also recording this just in case, so I can edit this out. So if you want to just relax for a few minutes and see if I can deal with this.
Okay, yeah, I mean, when
that was good though. You did it well.
Okay, so when we return, okay, it depends. I suppose we will have to start again. Okay, I'll do the intro shorter when I start again, and yeah, okay, but just try. I don't know why it's happening. I mean, sometimes we have a couple of minutes, but usually the code runs smoothly. I mean, we've had an entire online conference using this platform. Yeah. Anyway, yes, let's relax and wait.
Does this come out as a podcast as well?
Well,
Or
not
is
as
it just the YouTube?
No, it's a YouTube. Actually, we also have podcasts, but podcasts we do in a more traditional podcast audio only format. I mean, if you're going to do a podcast, it's better to do it using as base something that's more better sound than using Zoom. No, we also have podcasts. For each at least one or two for each issue of the journal. This is the idea. The idea is, to discuss something that is on the journal. Yeah, for example, we're going to have from the latest issue, we're going to have two broadcasts. One is today, it's the broadcast on Roberto's piece, and the which actually was from the previous issue from Thursday. Was it the last issue, Roberto, or the third issue of last year?
It was November, so it was the
third.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Roberto's broadcast is for the third issue of 2022, and in a couple of days we have. In a couple of days, on Thursday, we have the broadcast for the fourth issue of 2022, which will be on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universalities. Okay.
Okay, what I've done is to say that we're going to try and start again at 6:30. I have no idea why it isn't going through because we are streaming, but I will try as hard as possible to make sure I can get it through. So if you want to take a little break for 10 minutes, by all means do, but please be back by around 6:28.
Okay.
Paul, just in case at 6:30 it's still not working, is it worth us just carrying on as planned and just do a recorded version?
Yeah, we will do a recorded version in that case and see if we can upload it, afterwards.
Yeah.
It is. We have, however, how many people? 40 people, 46 people waiting. So I'd rather try and get it live.
Yeah, okay.
Did you see
I mean, we're recording all this anyway, and I can edit all of this nonsense out. But I want to try and make sure that we can do this properly.
Did you see the comment on YouTube that someone can see us on another channel?
Yeah, I just received a message to that effect, that we're being broadcast on the wrong channel.
Did they put the link in there? Which one?
But anyway, okay, let's say that
I'm looking at the cover page. Do we know what channel we're broadcasting on?
well, Haymarket, the usual Haymarket.
No, it won't be.
No, I mean, we're not, no, yes, you're right. Anyway, we do not know which channel we're broadcasting on. No, we do not.
Yeah, I've just looked it up. So we're currently being broadcast on the YouTube channel for Massimiliano's event, the next broadcast.
Yeah, that will be their end, Haymarket's end.
Okay, so there's a mix-up of YouTube codes. Okay.
What's the URL for that? Put it in the chat box for me.
Yep.
I think this will be because
We put it in the chat there.
we've moved it around a number of times. And obviously at some point somebody's just thought.
Okay, so to the 5 people that are actually watching us, I hope that it's just us. There's a technical mix-up. It's obvious that this is not Thursday's broadcast on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universality. This is, we are going to fix this, and again, apologies.
Okay, we're going to remain with a 6:30 start. So I've just posted on the where we should be, and given people 5 minutes to move. There's going to be a lot of editing. And obviously at some point somebody just thought, I really hate this job. Okay.
Paul, are we going to use the other link as this is, because this is okay, posted in the chat? Okay. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and apologies for this technical issue. Obviously, this is not the broadcast on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universality. This is going to be broadcast on Thursday. This is the broadcast on how to be a Marxist in the Academy, Althusserian theories of education. We apologize again. We had a technical issue with the original link, so we had to politely ask comrades to come to this link. I am Panagiotis Sotiris. I am an editorial board member of Historical Materialism Journal, and we would like to welcome you to this broadcast. We decided to have this broadcast because in the third issue of Historical Materialism for 2022, we had an article by Roberto Mozzachiodi on entitled "How to be a Marxist in Philosophy," which dealt with Louis Althusser and his attempt to answer questions related to education and education movements. And we decided to have this roundtable on Althusser's pertinence to questions of critical education, educational struggles, and movements. And we are very happy to have with us Roberto Mozzachiodi, who teaches at Goldsmith University and is also a member of the Historical Materialism Editorial Board. Giacomo Clemente, who teaches at the University of Milan Bicocca, and he has recently published a book on Althusser, actually on the Althusser group and their attempt to discuss questions of education in the 1960s. The book is entitled Sapere Ideologia Riproduzione, and we're going to paste the link so that people can search it and read it. This is in Italian, but it's a very important monograph because it presents the kind of laboratory of thinking that led to interventions such as Althusser's own manuscript on the reproduction of capitalism, or Althusser's well-known essay on ideology and the ideological apparatus of the state. But also books such as Baudelot and Establet's L'École capitaliste en France. And we also have David Baker from Westchester University. David recently published a book entitled Althusser and Education. We are also going to paste the link. It's a free access book, so that you can download it. It's also a very important contribution because it's a fresh reading of Althusser's writings that relate to questions of education and ideology, and it's also a very useful reminder on the need for a dialogue between Althusser and let's say critical education traditions. But I'm sure that David will also speak about this tonight. So without further ado, I give the floor to the three presenters, Roberto, with this order, first Roberto, then Giacomo, and then David. And if you want to, if you have any questions, please post them in the YouTube chat facility, and then we're going to relay these questions to the presenter so that we can have a dialogue. So, Roberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Panagiotis. Thanks for that introduction. Thank you for chairing. Thank you, David and Giacomo, for joining for this broadcast. So in the article that Panagiotis was just referring to, the difficulty of being Marxist in philosophy, I surveyed Louis Althusser's long-term engagement with questions concerning education, specifically the conditions, organization, and function of philosophical education. And there I show that these questions serve as a neglected but crucial context for understanding Althusser's shifting conception of a Marxist position within philosophy. In the article, I draw together a number of lesser known texts and unpublished writings to make the case that from early on in his career, Althusser's understanding of a Marxist philosophy and his assessments of the political priorities of the French Communist Party were strongly marked by his professional status as a philosophy professor in France's most elite university, the École Normale Supérieure. One of the aims of the essay was to complicate the picture of Althusser's shifting definitions of a Marxist philosophy. The trajectory of Althusser's formulation of Marxist philosophy tends to be narrated against the backdrop of a French Communist Party in the throes of de-Stalinization, and the lacunae that this opened up in the theoretical principles of the party. This contextualizing narrative normally links Althusser's changing position to the ways that the party negotiated with the notoriety and the success of his major works of 1965. And the paradigmatic example of this is obviously the humanist controversy. While the project of re-establishing the theoretical principles of the party was obviously very high on Althusser's agenda, I argue that the questions concerning education and Althusser's role within the education system also played an important role in his defining and redefining of Marxist philosophy. Althusser's position as a Marxist intellectual, a member of the French Communist Party, and a professional academic played an important role over how he conceived of a Marxist position within the discursive sphere of philosophy. And at the same time, this position also formed a point of focus for Althusser's activities within the party, namely the development of the party's policy on education, which is quite distinct from the party's policies on intellectuals and philosophy, which is usually the area of the party's activities that tends to be associated with Althusser's interventions. The education policies which the party developed as parts of its electoral ambition, as well as the positions it took or did not take in response to educational reforms of the day, were important factors in Althusser's self-understanding as a philosopher, a member of the Communist Party, and a professional teacher. In this set of comments, reflections today, I want to take this opportunity to look in a bit more detail at some of the archival fragments that I cite in the article, and to try to show how the landscape of education policy and reforms was in the background of Althusser's thinking when he was composing some of these texts. So one of the pieces of archival material that I cite in the essay is a questionnaire that Althusser drafted in 1950, which was addressed and circulated to fellow party members working as philosophy teachers within the French education system. The questionnaire consists of 11 sets of questions concerning the conditions and experiences of communist university teachers, and represents one of the earliest records of Althusser's inquiry into the politics of education and educational work. In terms of Althusser's own biography, this comes only 2 years after he joined the party and taken up his position in the École Normale Supérieure. In the broader context, this comes during the height of the Cold War, when Soviet cultural policy was in full swing within the French Communist Party, and the activities of party intellectuals and academics were heavily circumscribed according to the prerequisites of ideological struggle. And this broader context quite clearly marks the questionnaire. The introductory explainer which accompanies the questionnaire reads, quote, "The Central Committee of our party has long drawn the attention of intellectuals to the important role which falls to them in the present situation. Imperialism is at bay, but is preparing a new world war to try to escape the final crisis. But it can only start war if it wins people over to the idea of war and divides the working class. Faced with this ideological offensive, with the decomposition of bourgeois culture and with the disarray of young people from the bourgeoisie and the middle classes who attend high schools and universities, communist philosophy teachers must become aware of their increased responsibility." End of quote. So the questionnaire was clearly conducted in line with the Central Committee's ideological prescriptions. But another contextual factor is also important here, and that's the context of the party's education policy. So in 1947, under the auspices of the post-war coalition government comprising the PCF, the Socialist Party and the Christian Democrats, a package of education reforms entitled the Langevin-Wallon Plan was tabled by the government's Commission for the Reform of Education. The plan took its name from the two chairs of the Commission during its lifetime, Paul Langevin and Henri Wallon, both scientists and Communist Party members. Among the various provisions outlined in the plan, the key proposals were for a free, secular and compulsory education for pupils up to the age of 18, a common core curriculum for pupils aged 11 to 15, and the filtering of pupils beyond the age of 15 according to 3 types of aptitudes, each given equal weight in academic provisions. And these aptitudes were professional, technical or technological, and theoretical. The authors of the plan espoused the belief that all pupils, no matter their social origins, held distinct aptitudes, and education should be reformed to cultivate these distinct abilities rather than letting them flounder against a unilinear elitist scholasticism. But behind its professed democratization of education, the plan posed no questions of the historical and material determinations of these distinct aptitudes or how their cultivation would map on to the existing social relations. Ultimately, the Langevin-Wallon plan would never be formally adopted by the government, and the PCF would be expelled from the tripartite government in 1947. However, the plan would remain an enduring reference point for the PCF and would long function as its de facto position on education. This was primarily because its chief architects were Communist Party members, but also because it represented a missed opportunity for a comprehensive progressive reform of the French education system. A missed opportunity that would take on mythic status in the party's imaginary. But in its own time, the Langevin-Wallon plan was the product of compromise, primarily the compromise of several competing policy agendas in its drafting. The plan would therefore reflect the political circumstance of its making, reforms deriving from a project of national unity and political coalition, and thus of class collaboration. Hence, its central proposal to filter pupils according to distinct aptitudes, rather than question the social function of these supposedly fundamental categorizations. Althusser's questionnaire on philosophy teaching was therefore drafted in this context. The national popular unity of the Langevin-Wallon plan survived in the party's education policy, while its cultural policy prescribes strict ideological responsibilities over intellectual and academic activities. However, the nature of the questions posed in the questionnaire anticipate the limits of both Soviet cultural policy and the Langevin-Wallon plan, and raise a series of problems which would preoccupy Althusser throughout the 60s. So I'll read an extract from the questionnaire. Question 1, today, how does one teach philosophy as a communist? Question 1A, what is the nature of your responsibility as a professional? Question 1B, how do you envisage the responsibilities you have to your position in the party? Is it necessary to make students communists, to teach a philosophy of Marxist inspiration, to make a resolute effort to revert all problems to the current content of class struggle? Question 1C, how do you reconcile your professional responsibilities and your responsibilities as a party member? Question 2, what is the social origins of your students? What are the vital problems of the milieu or social milieus of which your students are a part? What is the moral situation of your students in relation to the issues of their background? Are they profoundly subjected to the influence of their environment or more or less detached from it, even in revolt from it? What ideological resistances and what prejudices do you encounter at present? Must education be conceived as a function of a social milieu and as the diffusion of ideology over students? Can we help students make themselves critical of their prejudices? What guiding ideas appear to you most appropriate to fight these prejudices today? Question 3, what are the subjects that lend themselves most readily to teaching Marxist philosophy? Question 4, to what extent can you carry out your teaching in the face of the bourgeois philosophy of the curriculum and the prejudices of your student? Is it necessary to critique the notions of bourgeois philosophy, to oppose them to Marxist theory, to reveal the class positions that they represent. And that's the end of the extract. So this is quite a fascinating document for a number of reasons, not least because this is probably the only record of Althusser, the great kind of theoretician, drawing on data collected from a survey for his work, but also in terms of the complex set of problems that it brings into view, particularly that it asks respondents to think through the overlaps and the disconnects between political commitments, professional responsibility, professional function, and pedagogical strategy. It asks, how does one teach philosophy as a member of the Communist Party in 1950 and an intellectual defender of the integrity of Marxist theory, given the bourgeois philosophy that one is professionally required to work with? What are one's political and intellectual priorities in such a position, and how does one mediate those priorities through concrete practices of pedagogy? How does one's own class status as an academic and the social makeup of the student body inflect those priorities? Taken together, these are questions which clearly defy the crude didacticism of Soviet cultural policy. They allude to a complex relationship between philosophy and class, where the class character of the philosophical canon and the student and teaching body does not necessarily predetermine the outcome of the pedagogical encounter. At the same time, they prompt respondents to recognize their conflicting responsibilities as Marxists, as communists, and as philosophy teachers, and to see each of these as important elements in their participation in class struggle. In this sense, the questionnaire opens a prism of analysis over class struggle with and through education, which moves far beyond the class unity presupposed and promoted by the Langevin-Wallon plan. Outside of its immediate context, the questionnaire is also interesting for how it foreshadows certain features of Althusser's broader trajectory. If we consider that Althusser's Agrégation seminars on the canon of liberal political philosophy, on Rousseau, Montesquieu, Machiavelli, etc., have become key texts for tracking the gestation of Althusserian materialism, the question of how to negotiate the bourgeois philosophy of the curriculum becomes quite salient. We can also see the questions concerning the subject position of students and whether there are potentials for politicizing students against their class origins, also anticipating Althusser's political activities at the ENS during the 60s. While there's no indication from the archive of how Althusser would ultimately use the data from this survey, one of his earliest publications certainly bears the mark of this exercise. In his article entitled The Teaching of Philosophy, published in L'Esprit in June 1954, Althusser took up the subject of what he called the crisis of philosophy teaching. For Althusser, this was not a crisis emerging from within philosophy itself. As he says, quote, "The struggle between Marxist materialism and idealism is directly or indirectly at the heart of contemporary philosophical thought. But this crisis is a normal crisis, and these fights of philosophy against itself, which reflect the social struggles of our time, far from condemning it, prove on the contrary the relevance and vitality of philosophy. It is not this crisis which condemns philosophy. In fact, this crisis gives philosophy its stature." End of quote. And this is quite an interesting claim, you know, compared to what he says in a text like Lenin and Philosophy. For Althusser, the crisis of philosophy teaching had its origins outside of the discursive field of philosophy, within the field of state education within the field of state education policy. At the time, Charles de Gaulle's government was seeking to relegate the status of the final year philosophy class in secondary education by introducing new options to the final year exams. For Althusser, the outcome of this reform would not only displace the educational importance of critical reflection, but more importantly, would threaten the sovereign status of theory within education. As he would say in the article, quote, "Without theory, all practice, scientific or social, remains blind to itself and in its development," end of quote. So while Althusser would ultimately defer to the Langevin-Wallon plan as the solution to this crisis in the article, in this 1954 text, he is already defending the political indispensability of theory. But here it is in the context of a political encroachment over philosophical education that Althusser raises this defense. And so in this context, theory is not a stand-in for the enlightened academic export of the professional revolutionary, as would be the charges levelled at his 1965 works, but is rather a direct reference to philosophical education. For Althusser, the preeminence of philosophical education was its peculiar ability to enable students to problematize the teachings of other academic disciplines and social existence as such. The marginalization of philosophical education via education reforms was therefore political. It had directly political effect. So the Langevin Wallon plan would remain the key reference point for the French Communist Party throughout the 50s and 60s. And during that time, it would be subordinate to the party's broader political aims. As such, it would become an obstacle to the development of a fully fledged communist strategy on education. And this would be the case up until 1967, at which point Pierre Jouquin, the Central Committee member in charge of education, would publish a text that would radically redefine the party's position on education. And this was his text, Propositions for a Democratic Reform of Teaching. The Jouquin plan, as it would become known, was framed as building on the foundations of the Langevin Wallon plan, but it clearly set itself apart from its predecessor on the basis of two main principles. The first concerned its conception of workers. In the Langevin Wallon plan, educational social mobility was seen as the most important way of defending the interest of workers. However, absent from the plan was the idea that teachers, researchers, and students were also workers who have interests which should be defended. In the Jouquin plan, these interests and this group of workers would be given priority in the kinds of reforms that were put forward. Thus, the plan's conception of workers' interests would be far more sectional than the populism of the Langevin Wallon plan. The second difference was its conception of democracy and education. Whereas the Langevin Wallon plan had conceived the democratization of education along the lines of aptitudes, the Jouquin plan advanced the idea that the professional requirements of scientific and technological progress conformed with the aims of social mobility. Here, science and technology were considered neutral forces which inherently undermine socially constructed professional hierarchies. Thus, according to the Jouquin plan, education reform should be guided by the aim of adapting students to the requirements of science and technology. As such, the plan would take a far more technocratic approach to the democratization of education. This shift in the party's position on education would play a direct role over Althusser's writing. In February 1965, Pierre Jouquin wrote to Althusser informing him that the Education Commission of the Central Committee was preparing a document which would constitute the party's overall programme for education and research, and this would ultimately become the Jouquin plan. In a letter, Jouquin invited Althusser to compile a report and to lead a discussion among communist philosophers on the current situation of philosophy teaching. The aim of the session, according to Jouquin, would be to consult communist philosophy teachers so that their insight and interest would be reflected in the plan. Althusser would respond to this letter stating the following, quote, "Your letter deals with problems that are too important and too complex, and within its limits, it inevitably leaves too many points in the dark for me to be able to give you a sufficient answer in writing to proposals which themselves need clarification and more precision. I therefore propose to see you and to examine with you all the questions you have posed," end of quote. So this indicates that Althusser participated in the research process that ultimately shaped the Jouquin plan, but from early on, he was critical of the analytical and political framing of the project. Two things to note about this exchange between Althusser and Jouquin. First, on the hard copy of Jouquin's letter, Althusser handwrote a list of names, presumably those who he considered best suited for such a session. And that list includes Balibar, of course, but also Macherey, Establet, and Roncet, among others. So this appears to mark the moment when this group turned its attention to questions concerning education and provides an important bit of context for understanding their aims in doing so. It was on the basis that the party was seeking to develop an original communist strategy on education, one that would finally move out of the shadow of the Langevin Wallon plan, that Althusser and others turned their attention to systematically research in education and academic institutions. Secondly, this proposition comes 1 year prior to the high point of the humanist controversy, when the party would formally admit Marxist humanism as its official philosophy, and by extension marginalize the Althusserian current. So if Althusser and friends were initially contributing to the Joachim plan in good faith, 1 year in, they had reason to pursue an agenda that pushed well beyond the humanist elements of the Langevin-Wallon plan. But also, as a preliminary draft of the Joachim plan appeared in September 1966, the group also had reason to form their analysis against the technocratic and corporatist thrust of the Joachim plan. And we can certainly read Althusser's twin preoccupation of this period, the political character of science and the role of the ideological state apparatus in reproducing class relations, as challenges to the scientism and the academic sectionalism which underpinned the Joachim plan. Establet and Baudelot make this Althusserian rebuttal explicit in one of the concluding sections of L'École capitaliste en France. So the development of the Joachim plan, the direction it took beyond the involvement of Althusser and others, undoubtedly played an important role in shaping the research agenda of the École group. And certainly the inadequacy of their plan to anticipate or address the demands that were raised about education during 1968 also played an important role. So Althusser's ongoing engagement with the party's education policy was an important factor in his body of work, not just in the writings which explicitly deal with education, but also his various formulations of Marxist philosophy. But this was just one factor among many which constituted for Althusser the conflicting demands of being a Marxist in philosophy, as his 1950 questionnaire attests to. If Althusser's body of work remains useful for analysing contemporary education and shaping how we confront struggles in the sector today, it's in the expansiveness of his experience of being a Marxist in philosophy. This was an experience which attempted to reconcile political commitment, pedagogical strategy, and philosophical inquiry, despite the autonomy of these distinct levels. Althusser's enduring contribution to a Marxist theory of education is in his attempt to think together political questions on education, whether that be education policy, the political function of education, or the industrial struggles of academic personnel, together with questions on pedagogy and philosophy. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Roberto. Again, to our viewers, we apologize. This is not the Massimiliano, the broadcast on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universality. This is the broadcast how to be, this is on Althusser and education. And we had a technical issue with the original link, so we are using this link. I now give the floor to Giacomo Clemente for his presentation. As I already mentioned in the introduction, Giacomo has written an important book in Italian. Hopefully it will somehow find its way to appear also in English, that deals with the so-called École project, the schools project, a collective project of research of the Althusserian group in the second half of the 1960s, which was in a certain way the laboratory out of which came interventions such as Althusser's ideology and the ideological apparatus of the state, and Baudelot and Establet's book on the capitalist school in France. Giacomo, you have the floor. Again, just a small for our viewers, if you want to ask any questions, please use the YouTube chat function, post your questions there, and we will relay to the presenters.
Thank you, Panagiotis, for the presentation. In my brief presentation, I would like to focus on some still little known suggestions that Althusser and his group in the late 60s devoted to the school. The best known Althusserian thesis, even today, makes the school an ideological apparatus that serves to reproduce the relation of production. I will point out a declination of this thesis. It is a declination that makes school and university education the element that even intervenes in the exchange between labor, power, and wages. More precisely, we will see how education is the element that supports the ideological representation of the exchange between labor, power, and wages as equivalent commodities. This is an important point. First of all, we can say that the theoretical development of Althusserism regarding the function of education in schools and universities can be divided into two phases. The first phase, which Roberto has very well explored in this article, regards a little-known text by Althusser, Problèmes étudiants, written in January 1964. At the core of Problèmes étudiants lies the issue of a certain pedagogical function that, within the framework of a materialist epistemology, essentially the one presented in his On the Materialistic Dialectic, represent this pedagogical function, the device allowing the vertical transmission of scientific generalities, that is, of contents of true knowledge. Transmission between, this is an important point, those who know and those who do not know. At this stage, in other words, Althusser's aim is to safeguard the transmission of true knowledge against an inauthentic transmission of false knowledge, which is ideological knowledge. Inauthentic transmission such as that theorized by GTU, Groupe de Travail Universitaire. For example, the collective work on knowledge and the knowledge as effect of the work of the group, and so on. The Althusserian defense of an unequal pedagogical relation, the Althusserian defense of the professor as the only legitimate speaker, as the only holder of true knowledge, this defense is motivated by the need to guarantee the transmission of scientific knowledge, that is, true knowledge. This means that the university, precisely because it's structured into those who know and those who do not know, into professors and students, represent for Althusser, at this stage of his theoretical development, the privileged space for this kind of transmission of true knowledge. The second historical phase, marking a radical break with the first, by admission of Althusser himself in Sur la reproduction, where he said that his gesture is too theoretical and so on. At this stage, in line with the formula contained in the Ideology and Ideological State Apparatus, the question is that of the relationship between the school apparatus and the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. To refer to the second phase, it is possible to refer to a large number of Althusser's unpublished typescripts and manuscripts inked to an unfinished collective project titled École, as Panagiotis said. The first important document belonging to this project is dated March 1968. It's Le Mythologie Scolaire by Pierre, a very beautiful text. The last document, dated November 1969, consists of 3 notes on the geography and the history of the formation of the bourgeois school, co-written by Macherey and Christian Baudelot. Analysis of these documents allow us to see how the educational process, far from representing an object of mere occasional interest, was considered by both Althusser and the group Spinoza as a whole to be a crucial issue, seen as wholly decisive, or if one aims at understanding the real powers behind the functioning of social reproduction. At this point, I would like to say a few words about the third chapter of École, entitled Scolarisation et Travail Salarié, Scholarization and Wage Labor. The theoretical framework of the central thesis contained in this chapter is that of wage labor. Labor power, we know, is exchanged as a commodity whose value is determined by that of its reproduction. The worker sells his labor power as a commodity whose value is determined by the value of the means of its reproduction. It is from this logic, as is well known, that there is valorization of capital. Labor power, insofar as it is placed in the sphere of the production process, is placed in the order of the quantitative increment of labor time that gives rise to surplus value embedded in the commodity produced. In other words, the logic of waged labor necessarily defers to that of exploitation, since it defers to a logic of extortion. A first important point to emphasize lies in the thesis of the Althusserian group, according to which, far from being, as it is in fact, an unequal exchange, what on the capitalist side is the valorization of capital, on the worker side is surplus labor, the exchange appears in experience to be an exchange of equivalent commodities. The background is the well-known one of the imaginary relation to the real conditions of existence that Althusser will articulate in ideology and ideological state apparatuses. This imaginary relation to the real conditions also happens in the exchange of labor power, in a line of absolute equality that conceals the essential inequality between necessary labor and surplus labor. Labor, as it appears in experience, corresponds to the price of labor. There is a difference between how the exchange of labor power really happens and how the exchange of labor power appears in the economical practice. There is a distinction between the real plan, the one discovered by Marx, and the ideological plan as imaginary plan, the one discovered by Althusser. Of course, we know that the ideological plan is not an alternative plan that conceals out the former, but just the opposite is what makes it work. If, as things really happens, there is a labor power and a wage, as the same things are presented in ideological representation, there is labor and what in École is called wage form salaire. Here in École, it is said that, I quote, the sale and purchase of labor power takes a different form in practice, which is the wage form. La vente, l'achat de la force, and so on. Form salaire. This is the important notion. The notion of form, in fact, that is continually used by the Althusserian group in École, reveals precisely this ideological status of the social mechanism. We will see later, for example, how the notion of form is a notion that will also be used for education. If the school is one of the factors in the reproduction of the labor power, as it appears, as it is ideological presented, it is a school form. Again, it is precisely this imaginary representation of the school as school form that makes the real mechanism of school work. Regarding the unequal exchange of labor power, we say that from that imaginary point of view, the wage form is worth the labor. The wage form salaire, dispensed by the capitalist, is worth the worker's labor. The worker's labor is worth the capitalist wage form. From the ideological point of view, the wage form is the symmetrical equivalent of labor, and labor does not contain surplus labor. It is in the sense that form wage, form salaire, and labor are equivalent commodities. The result of this thesis is important. In fact, if the real mechanism of capital valorization is concealed from the plane of imaginary representation, namely, it's that its function to reproduce this mechanism, then this capital valorization is presented as self-valorization of capital and not exploitation. In École is written, I quote, in this way, the surplus value contained in the value of the commodities produced by labor appears as created by capital, the other factor of production. All distinction thus disappears between the necessary labor for the reproduction of labor power, only paid in fact, and surplus labor, unpaid, appropriated by capital without compensation. Thus disappears all trace of the exploitation of labor, which in the final analysis is based on this difference. End of quote. This difference is the difference between surplus labor and labor power. Why is this thesis crucial to understanding the school apparatus? Because, as I mentioned before, the educational process is one of the reproductive factors of the labor power. Scholastic education is the material cause of a qualitative modification of the worker, a modification that is essential to his adjustment to the means of production. The worker is always an already trained worker. It is in this sense that, as I said in École, quote, school is an effect of waged labor, end of quote. But from an ideological point of view, what is an education? Education, like wage, is in fact taken in the same relationship between real and imaginary plan. In École, it is said that education, from the imaginary point of view, is, this is a crucial notion, is a qualification. Qualification of labor is the ideological representation of the necessary labor power formation. Qualification is therefore an ideological attribute of labor, and to say labor is always to refer to a degree of its qualification. But if, as we have seen, there is a relationship of equivalence between form wage and labor, then this equivalence is determined by the degree of labor's qualification. If the labor is qualified labor, then it is the qualification that determines the form wage of labor. From the ideological point of view, higher qualification causes higher wage form. Labor's qualification is the basis of wage form. A certain amount of qualification causes a certain amount of wage form. I quote, qualification, it is, in the eyes of the worker as well as of the capitalist, a determined power or capacity of work which prefigures the work itself and which indicates in advance its value in view of a determined wage, equivalent in the form of money to this value. End of quote. The value of labor is the value of qualification. What does it mean? It means that qualification is the root of the imaginary representation of the self-valorization of capital. If qualification is an attribute of labor, and if the wage form is determined by qualification, then it is qualification that hides the distinction between necessary labor and surplus labor. I quote, the qualification of the worker is thus, like the whole wage form, a mechanism such that labor power cannot be exploited without this exploitation being simultaneously concealed and unrecognized. End of quote. It's very powerful, this quote. I represent labor process as based on the exchange of commodities of equivalent value because I represent labor as qualified labor. Qualification is the ideological attribute of labor, and the capitalist buys my labor according to the degree of my qualification. The exchange is symmetrical. Exchange, from the ideological point of view, through qualification, thus conceals the real factor of capital valorization. Qualification, which is the imaginary representation of the labor power formation, is what sustains the ideological relation between equivalent commodities, form wage and labor. If qualification is the determinant of wage form, then it is qualification that masks the real relationship between wages and labor power. Here, then, is a fundamental thesis contained in this chapter of École. The school, which from the imaginary point of view is called school form scolaire, the notion of form retort here, is the apparatus that, being the material condition of qualification that is effectively labor power education, is functional in masking exploitation. If the wage form is determined by the worker's qualification, then the school form that materially dispenses that qualification is the apparatus that ideologically conceals and reproducts and hides the real mechanism of valorization of capital. The school form is the condition of the wage form. Last point. The school, as it appears, distributes qualifications. Not only, it is also the criterion of their measurement. We have seen that the wage form is determined by the degree of qualification. The degree implies a measurement. More qualified work, more wage form increases. In École, it is said that, I quote, the existence of a wage hierarchy always refers directly to a hierarchy of work qualification, end of quote. But how is the school the criterion of measurement of a qualification that also dispenses? One must always keep in mind the double plan that we have mentioned. The plan of how things really are and the plan of how those same things appear. The real plan and the ideological plan as the plan that makes the former work and they reproduce it. While is it true that the real functioning of the school is socially determined, it is a point that is one of the central theoretical cores of Baudelot and Establet's book, it is equally true that that functioning remains hidden. The school is in fact imaginarily presented, now more than ever, today more than ever, as a technical space of knowledge distribution. Althusser, in Problèmes étudiants, thought exactly so. The technical distribution of knowledge is a totally ideological procedure. The school is presented as an apparatus that distributes determined knowledge, classical, technical, and so on, based on what are thought as natural aptitude of students. Obviously, these natural aptitudes are nothing more than the naturalization of socially determined differences, relating, for example, to the cultural differences of working class and middle class families and so on. It is the supposed technicality of its distribution of knowledge that is the foundation of its supposed objective measurement of qualification. Every dispensed qualification is already a qualification placed on a scale of supposedly objective measurement, because the qualification is dispensed technically, that is based on the natural aptitudes of the students. In short, in École, the school is the dominant apparatus because ideologically it masks through the notion of qualification and that of individual aptitude as an imaginary condition of its technical measurement, the fundamental character of wage labor, exploitation. I quote the final quote, the worker is identified with a deeply illusory object, with a fictitious personality that has only an imaginary status at the level of the ideological representations generated by the objective mechanism of the wage form. End of quote. I finished. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Giacomo, and I pass the floor to David Baker. Again, I remind our viewers, this is not the broadcast on Massimiliano Tomba's Insurgent Universality. This is the broadcast on Althusser and education. Apologies, due to a technical issue, we had to show each, let's say, YouTube links. The floor is now to David Baker, who has written recently a book exactly on Althusser and education.
Thank you, Panagiotis, and thanks for thanks Historical Materialism and Roberto for your essay and for this event. And thank you, Giacomo, for that wonderful paper. That was deep. I'm still processing it in real time. Just for a little context for everyone, I'm currently translating L'École capitaliste in France into English, where I've translated about the first 50 pages. I'm going to do the rest over the summer and the fall. And this is extremely helpful. It's all very relevant. So I have just some comments, some short comments on these issues. Actually, I think that Giacomo's comments just now are extremely great place, really great place for us to pick up in this conversation. So all of this is very helpful for my project in translating this book. And what I want to talk about is something that I'm finding kind of helpful and clarifying based on what I've already done. So I'm going to read this. So what I find surprising and happily clarifying about Roberto's piece is an answer to a question I found in translating the first 50 pages of L'École, which is, why does the concept of ideology in L'École feel like it's pre-ISA's essay? Like, why does that? I got that feeling in the translation. I noticed this, that Baudelot and Establet, they talk of revealing a truth behind an ideology of what they call the two networks within the supposedly unified school system, demystifying the ways the school system is presented as a unified thing, but is actually two systems serving different class interests, bifurcated by class struggle, as evidenced by dropout rates and other data. Their claim in the beginning of this book is that there's no unity of the school and there's no school unity. It's divided by class. And that the book is sort of aimed at dismantling this, what they call ideology. And the concept of ideology behind their utterance sounds to me more like the Althusser for Marx, where the notion of ideology is, sort of, I think, cast as a kind of toxin of consciousness that must be cleaned up by science, a mask that must be lifted, to use Giacomo's language, and that is to say, an illusion that must be clarified. And I still find the intervention in L'École about the concept of the unity and disunity very helpful. I use it as an example. I use it as an example of the generative potentials for Althusserian analysis today in education in my book. But something still bothers me, and it's that the concept of ideology in the book doesn't sound or feel like the concept of ideology in the ISAs, which is what Terry Eagleton and Jan Ryman would call an ideology of practice. That practical ideology, the kind that the apparatus manifests as imagined relations to real conditions vis-a-vis interpolation, it's not there in L'École when I'm reading it. Rather, in L'École, it has a concept of ideology as consciousness, which is what Eagleton and Ryman would say, that ideology is stuff in the head. And even further, Ryman makes a distinction between ideology theory and ideology critique, where the latter says that a certain position is non-ideological and must be defended against ideology, and the former is where all positions in the terrain are ideological, battling it out for hegemony. L'École, when I'm reading it, sounds like an ideology critique with an ideology as consciousness concept, whereas the ISA's essay and on the reproduction, the book that was written, whereas that concept is an ideology theory with a concept of ideology as practice. So I was like, what's up with this? And here Roberto provides the answer. That's what's so wonderful about this. Those first 50 pages in L'École are Althusser. Quite literally, Roberto's telling us that Althusser wrote them. And I think he's writing them before he's writing the ISA's essay in the material that would become on the reproduction, as the school's project or L'École project was going on since at least 1967. And the other thing he's saying is that this project, the school's project, was paralyzed by Althusser's change in his concept of ideology, pre and post the 68 moment. And that's one of the things that throws it into a bit of a disarray. They have all these claims about the school form that Giacomo just talked about, but then Althusser comes out with he comes out with Lenin and Philosophy, and it's got the ISA's essay in it, and he's written on the reproduction. And now he's saying, he's talking about the ideological state apparatuses. It's like actually a paradigmatically different concept of ideology. So this confirms what many of us know, I think, which is that there's a line of demarcation in Althusser's thinking about ideology and education. And that line is before and after the ISA's essay. And I think I would characterize that line marks the shift from what Eagleton and Ryman and others call ideology as consciousness to ideology as practice. But this actually gets us into a fun little tangle when we look at the history of these things, which Roberto also does. So if we're to believe Rancière in the English translation of Althusser's lesson, which came out in 2010, it was Rancière's essay on theories of ideology taught in the autonomous universities created by the days of May 68, which caused this switch. Rancière's essay is a rebuke of Althusser's ideology as consciousness account from the days of Marx and before. Rancière says that Althusser is not, the concept of ideology in science is not materialist. And he says, Rancière actually says, that ideology is in the institutional practices, not in the head, thus qualifying Althusser's account as a kind of maintaining a kind of bourgeois positivism. And so Rancière goes on to say that Saul Carge was going to go publish this essay by Rancière in a Spanish collection, and gave Rancière's piece to Althusser for comment before he was going to go to publication. And this it appears to be happening right before that fitful window when Althusser is writing on the reproduction. And Roberto said he wrote it in a few days. I didn't know that. I didn't realize that he'd written it in a few days. To me, reading all of this, it looks like Althusser agreed with Rancière, changed his tune about ideology, and then we get the ISA's essay. So all of this is to say, if Althusser's paradigm shift from ideology as consciousness to ideology as practice is the spanner in the works that stalls the schools project, and also explains the ideology of consciousness concept in L'École capitaliste in France, and that shift was caused by Rancière's critique of Althusser, then we can see it as Rancière's revenge. That's the title of my comments, Rancière's revenge, because the schools project indecisiveness with respect to concepts of ideology comes from Rancière's critique of his teacher, which I actually think, I mean, to me, I don't know, maybe you all disagree, but to me, it seems like what Althusser is doing is saying that's a really good point. And to Rancière, at least if we believe Rancière. So ultimately, I think we benefit from Rancière's revenge, since the ISA's essay was one of the most impactful and creative theories of ideology in education in a generation, if not more, maybe even a century. But we have the ruins of the schools project that we have to reconstruct, which was also ultimately paralyzed and decimated by this paradigm shift, which Roberto's paper tracks so very well. So that's really some of the end of my comments there about Rancière's revenge. Thank you again.
Okay, thanks a lot, David. Let's see if we have any questions from in the chat. Okay. Anyway, yes. Again, to our viewers, this is not continuing the debate on Massimiliano Tomba's insurgent universality. This is the How to Be a Marxist in Academy, a historical materialism broadcast. I apologize, we had a problem with the link. And while we are waiting for questions from the audience, I will just, by the way, there are still some people waiting. No, I think they're not still waiting at the old link anyway. I will just use my chair privilege to say a few also a few comments. I mean, sometimes when we discuss Althusser's interventions in education, we tend to forget the conjuncture where they were brought in. The conjuncture before these interventions and the conjecture Althusser in a way also intervened and changed it. For better or worse, classical Marxism, especially Soviet Marxism, had a rather conservative view of education. Education was basically transmission of knowledge. The only questions that had to be posed were questions of access. How can working class children have better access to education? Or more general ideological questions like, having a broader scope, including Marxism, etc. There was not, until the 1950s, any real critical thinking on the educational process per se, and also on the relationship between the educational process and the labor process and the capitalist production process. And in a certain way, this tendency to treat education as basically class neutral, in the same way as science was treated as class neutral, or the only form of class intervention in science was the bourgeois attempt to block science, in a certain way mirrored the Soviet Marxism conception of the production process. The production process was also basically positive. The production forces were the driving force of history, and the problem with the bourgeoisie was that it was blocking the development of the productive forces, and this was in a certain way reflected in a tendency to not question science, education, educational hierarchies. And we know, and this is something that, and part of the movements of the 60s, part of the broader, let's say, 1968 experience, which actually started in 1960, if we look at Italy, for example, is exactly the questioning of these two aspects. And it's very fascinating to see the kind of how people were trying to articulate a critique which was not, and also trying to create the theoretical tools to articulate such critique. Both of the production process, one can see the various forms of criticism, for example, of the capitalist production process. One can think, for example, of early operaismo, of Raniero, of Macherey's critique of the articles on the capitalist use of machinery, and this entire tradition that started to question the labor process, question the role of technology, which is very, very significant. It's very fascinating to see how this moved on to the student movement, which sort of gradually moved from simply an anti-authoritarian critique of education, which is very, very common in the early 60s. And this can account, for example, for the popularity of the Frankfurt School, in particular Marcuse, both in North America, but also in Europe. But also how this gradually becomes a critique of educational process per se. For example, one can see it, for example, in Italy, when Guido Viale writes his famous article against the university in Quaderni Piacentini, I think it's early 1968, you can see a more fully developed critique. And you can see these debates in France. You can see it, for example, one can see the significance of André Gauche and his book on neo-capitalism, the 1964 book, which are very interesting. And it's also part of the debates to which Althusser and his students react. So they react critically. They have a critical reaction because they believe that such positions might sort of be a deviation for a more strictly Marxist critique of education, but still it's part of a debate that education is not neutral, educational hierarchies are not neutral, there's some interplay of science and ideology. And although Althusser seems reluctant, this is very obvious in his pre-1965 text, such as Student Problems, 1964 text, he seems to be rather reluctant to fully engage in such early, let's say, more anti-authoritarian criticism of higher education because of his fear that this would undermine his insistence that Marxism is a science, that what we need in terms of theory can only be articulated as a science. It is obvious in the École project that both Althusser and his students start to have a much more critical conception of science production, which is also based on a much more critical conception of the relationship between relations of production and forces of production, with the emphasis being on the primacy of the relations of production over the productive forces, which is, by the way, it's the beginning and the starting argument exactly of the manuscript on reproduction. It begins with exactly these questions. It's 1969, it's right after 1968. It's also been fueled by other experiences. The way, for example, the Cultural Revolution was read and perceived in Western Europe, and the movements of that period is also very, very important, because for them this seems like a critique of the capitalist road, the critique of capitalist forms of production. And I think this is the only way to understand both this project and Althusser's actual, shift of positions. It's obvious that Althusser begins to have a much more, let's say, dialectical conception, both ideology, both science, and I think this is very important. But I also like to add, although this is like moving beyond the questions of education, that for Althusser this is also part of a theoretical self-criticism. We know that Althusser, at the moment that the entire Marxist scene was trying to absorb, let's say, the significance of the 1965 books, Althusser already embarks on a very severe, I say, self-criticism of his position, and in particularly, let's say, a conception of latent structures, a kind of a social grammar, let's say, approach to social reality. So when Althusser negates any form of, let's say, kind of distinction between surface phenomena and deeper structures, and structures tend to be treated more like reproduced encounters that last. The notion of the encounter already emerges after 1967, and relationships are encounters. That is, there is a contingent, a non-teleological element in them. So there are relations that tend to be reproduced. What it means to be reproduced, unless you try to find the answer in some sort of deeper structure governing surface relations, then you need to see why people tend to reproduce the same ritual, the same practices. And I think this is where not only ideology enters, but also the importance of material apparatuses. Relations tend to be reproduced. People tend to repeat the same things, to accept as normal capitalist relations of production, but also in the broader sense, social relations, exactly because these are reproduced by means of particular apparatuses, which are state apparatuses, not state in the typical legal form. They are state in their function on the side of reproduction, on the side of guaranteeing the. I think this is also an important aspect. Ideological apparatuses, reproduction, encounters that last, are important aspects of Althusser's philosophical self-criticism, let's say, of the correction of his initial, let's say, structuralism, even though this might sound a little bit unfair for Althusser, but I think this is important. But I also insist that you can find here echoes of a much broader critique of not only capitalist education, but also of the labor process and the capitalist organization of production. And you can see that as Althusser evolves, as his work evolves also in his dialogue and his influence, for example, on Baudelot. Baudelot could not make his shift towards a more critical conceptualization of the evolution of, let's say, the Soviet system towards an original form of state capitalism without this dialogue with Althusser. And you have the same, again, elements, primacy of the relations of production. If you read books such as Class Struggles in the USSR, this is more evident. And Baudelot acknowledges the influence of Althusser in many instances. Of course, you can see it in the works that came out of the École project. such as Baudelot and Establet, and an entire tradition. And if you look at other countries, and then, for example, in the Greek case, which is the context that I'm more familiar on, Althusser and Althusserian notions were very much the theoretical tools used from radical left tendencies in the 1970s or 1980s, exactly as a way to criticize and struggle against the capitalist organization of education. And in this sense, retracing this dialogue is very, very, very important, especially since what is also important about Althusser is that Althusser, at the same time, attempted to, let's say, salvage some notion of scientific knowledge, which I think is important. He attempted to maintain that still there is something, which is, of course, it's never absolute, it's always let's say, tainted with ideology. It's never fully separated from ideology. It's always traversed by class struggle. But there is something like knowledge. This is also an important aspect, which is very important. Both. I mean, this helps us. I think this is pertinent even today because it enables drawing many lines of demarcation. It enables drawing a line of demarcation for scientism or for a technocratic approach or for, let's say, any naive trust the science approach. At the same time, it draws a line of demarcation with very easy, let's say, social construction of knowledge approaches that tend to blur the distinction between knowledge and non-knowledge and sort of create where everything is just an opinion. And Althusser does that without falling back into, let's say, a Neoplatonic stance like Badiou. When Badiou opposes doctor as opposed to, let's say, knowledge, it doesn't refer exactly to knowledge, but it's a more Platonic conception of the idea. Whereas Althusser and the work by students of Althusser, like Michel is always a name that we can refer to. It's much more procedural, much more real, has more to do. And I think that the research that all three of you have been doing currently also brings how Althusser was not the idea of a detached, philosopher. Althusser was into struggles around education. He had a rather insightful conceptualization of the stakes in struggles, all the stakes, all the ways that you can bend the stick to the wrong side, one might say. And he was involved in such subject and in a dialogue. And I think this is very important. I think that's why the work you are doing is a contribution not only to the study of Althusser. People might say, okay, there are people who like Althusser and there are people who are going to deal with any aspect of Althusser's work. No, this is an important aspect of reopening the discussion about what it means to have a Marxist critique of capitalist education and the capitalist production of knowledge and ideology within educational apparatus, which also is very important as ways to, let's say, to navigate ourselves as educators, as being part of such apparatus. It enables also a kind of, let's say, critical self-reflexivity or collective reflexivity of what an educational apparatus is, what are the stakes, and how we can keep the struggle going on inside education.
Yeah. Can I?
Yes, please.
I'm totally agree with you, and I find your observation about the articulation of development of Althusserian theoretical thinking about school very interesting, because it's very curious that in the second phase, Althusser critiques the Althusser of the first phase. That is, the Althusser of the technical distribution of knowledge. Althusser in the first phase thinks with the category of the technical distribution. And the second phase, with the introduction of social division, in all the state's apparatuses, Althusser finished to criticize himself for how he analyzed the school. On this point, you talk about conjuncture. For me, I have an observation on this point for David, but of course it is extended to everyone. Precisely for this articulation on from the first phase to the second phase, we have not named the most important philosophical couple regarding the notion of school, Bourdieu and Passeron. And Bourdieu and Passeron are very, very presented in the École capitaliste in France. I think that Bourdieu and Passeron are the trace under the text of École capitaliste in France. What do you think about this point? Because I think that in the 60s, the relation between Althusserian group and Althusser and Bourdieu and Passeron could be divided in three parts. The first part is very complicated and it's related to the Les Héritiers. The second part, I think that is related to an article, very beautiful article of Macherey, that is L'amour de l'art, regarding L'amour de l'art de Bourdieu and I don't remember. And Macherey wrote an article against this Bourdieu. And the third phase is precisely École capitaliste in France. That is a real broke with the horizon of Bourdieu and Passeron. So I think that this relationship between Althusserian group and Bourdieu and Passeron is very important to understand the real trick of Althusserian thought. What do you think about this point?
David, you want to say something?
Sure. Yes. I think that's a great question. While I was researching my book on Althusserian education, I did come across, I had studied the inheritors and in Bourdieu and Passeron, and also, it's a book that's a compendium of articles from the mid 60s called Reproduction in Education and Society, which, in the first part has their almost like geometrical style. It has almost like a sort of like they're trying to channel Spinoza almost a little with their lemma and the scholia. They're talking, but their thesis is about symbolic violence, very dense, hard to get even for someone who's used to stuff that's hard to get. That essay is hard. And in the preface to that book, the English translation, obviously, in the preface, Bourdieu writes with a kind of salty, snarky tone that the Althusserians say they're talking about schools and apparatuses, but I was the one that was talking about it the whole time, and they're just taking from me. And to me, what that seemed to open up was a sense that I have no idea actually the historiography, that moment in the dialogue that's happening, between Bourdieu, Passeron, and what's going on with Althusser's group. And I couldn't say, I couldn't adjudicate whether or not Bourdieu was right. I mean, it sounds like something that an academic would say. But also, my sense, just having read these very basic texts and not done archival work on this particular question, what we'd call the problematic in the inheritors is so very different. And I think that I'm trying to think if this actually appears in L'École, like in a preface, but they're talking about K-12 schooling, primary, secondary education. The inheritors is targeted specifically at higher education. And it's coming out of a specific kind of crisis, I think, I guess, at the end of the 50s in French higher education, which is a sort of crisis of the state. Like, what does it mean to be French? What's the role of higher education in that? And that, you know, what they're saying is that there's this process of transmission of cultural privilege that happens. You know, and I mean, I could see that as kind of structuring or calling forth a response from Marxists saying like, well, hold on a second, there's a whole other thing that you're leaving out. What about primary and secondary? What about the class struggle? I mean, I'm Bourdieu, you know, I think is sort of, he's drawing from Marx a little bit, but it's Durkheim. And I think that actually, to the extent that Durkheim is kind of sociologizing a Hegelian theory, you know, we don't have the Marxist, you know, reversal of the materialist intervention that we have at Bourdieu. So, you know, I definitely see them in conversation. I can't tell whether Bourdieu is right, that they're taken from him. But I think that they're importantly, and this is the last thing I'll say about this, I think that it's important to recognize that to me anyway, there's a conceptual paradigmatic difference between what's happening in Bourdieu and Passeron and what's happening in Althusser and that. And the reason why I think I mean, there's all kinds of philosophical reasons, you know, to justify that, but it's important to maintain that line because as we get to the 80s, and then as critical education emerges, critical pedagogy, at least in Britain and the US, you know, Bourdieu and Althusser are just lumped into the same category. It's Paul Willis that does it, I'm pretty sure. He just says they're social reproduction theorists, they're mechanical functionalists, determinists, and we have to move on into this thing called resistance theory, you know, which then Giroux takes on. And, you know, no, I just don't, I don't buy that for a second. You can't lump them into the same category at all. And so I don't know. I would definitely want to know more about that moment.
Thanks a lot. Roberto, you want to say something? We also have a couple of questions, but
yeah. So I think with 68, there's both an anxiety amongst Althusserians of a growing kind of corporatism within struggles that looks at education and looks at the university as a site of struggle that has far more pertinence within the economy than it really does, while at the same time acknowledging that, you know, the explosion of 68 represented an unforeseen site of political alliances that were significant organizationally, that any of the you know, mainstream political parties had no foresight over. And I think that Bourdieu and Passeron for Althusser can contribute somewhat to that inward-looking analysis of class reproduction. The school education is where class is reproduced and not in the site of work. You know, that the class is this dynamic process that manifests itself not as this transcendental fixed identity, but as a mode of oppression that one is exposed to at various levels, most explicitly in sites of work, but not exclusively, you know, and forms of housing, forms of racialization, and so on. So I think that there's an anxiety that there's too much emphasis being put both theoretically and politically on the purchase of schools and education, while at the same time recognizing that you know, this arm of the state clearly has produced a political organizational freak of nature that had very real potential to completely do away with the kind of silos that had existed up until that point, that had prevented workers and students from allying in struggle. So yeah, I think that kind of tension is there in the École project, but there's an attempt to put education in its place within a broader assessment of class struggle that plays out across various levels, but is nonetheless very important and unique in its potentials.
Thanks a lot, Roberto. Yeah, if I may just add a small historical detail. It's interesting that although this attempt to have a more upward, you know, don't be engaged into an inward relationship to education, like try to bring cross-struggle back into education. This is a common element in most movements around 1968. There is even, I mean, the more classical example is the Italian case, which we are more, where although in a certain way the Italian student 68 precedes the French one, it opts for a kind of exit, which can account for much more work on radical politics in the factory rather than in education, whereas in France, both the École project, but also other tendencies sort of continued to insist on works and movements inside education. You don't see the same kind of exit. You see it in some tendencies, you see it in the establishment movement, the movement to go and, you know, work in the factories, etc. But both in it's interesting that they continued this kind of critical work. Anyway, now we have two questions so far. One is, and I can read so that, I mean, Marxist philosophical education is always imminent, focused on practice and situation, and the abstractive notions of education and philosophy presented as disciplines are part of the disruption of the imminent dialectics of that inscribes class struggle into knowledge acquisition, critique, and transmission. Question mark. I mean, this is the question. How this is so? This is the one question we have. Yeah, and there's also another question. Perhaps you want to combine both questions and say something on both of them, which is from Comrade Vincent. It says, thank you for the talks. Do you have any real-life tips for Marxist leftist studying at neoliberal universities? Any sources where people can self-study leftist philosophy? Well, I can answer that. Aids and broadcasts are a starting point also, so stay tuned. But no, Vincent, this is not their books. They're just promoting the journal. Anyway, these are two questions that I have so far. Who wants to go first? Roberto?
I mean, I can answer the second question. I'm going to have to think a bit harder on the first question, if it is indeed a question. I mean, there's never been a better time to find useful experience and writings about struggle within education, you know, like what's happening currently in the US with the teachers' strikes, but also, you know, across Europe, there are massive trade union led, it seems, struggles rather than rank and file struggles. But nevertheless, struggles are taking place against the neoliberal university at the moment. So I would advise to participate in that. In terms of sources where people can find information, I mean, notes from below, the website and publication. They have a education arm to their activities. They're doing really amazing work on rank and file efforts to self-organize within universities and schools. So I definitely would recommend looking at Notes from Below in their education bulletins, but also there's a lot of writings by academic activists, mainly in the UK, but not exclusively in the UK.
Thanks a lot, Roberto. David, Giacomo, you want to say something on the questions we have had?
I was just gonna do a shameless plug. I write a newsletter, a weekly newsletter called Schooling in Socialist America, where my new project, Althusser was and education was a big project that I had for years and years and resulted in this book. But as I was finishing up the book and after it was published, I started, and it was truly the Althusserian influence kind of directing me. My focus shifted to trying to understand the actual state apparatus as such in the US, specifically the finance, school finance, how the money actually works, what the touch points between capital and education actually kind of are, materially speaking, in the budgets and the expenditures and the policies that hold this all together. I found in the critical education universe that there was very little, if anything, written about just how school finance works, how the money in education kind of flows. And to some degree, maybe this is just an example, my personal example of how to kind of engage as someone, in the university context. I found that, I was writing about Althusser and thinking about Althusser and teaching, elements of this, but I found that I could be of service to movements, to unions, to people organizing in Philadelphia, my city, and elsewhere, by being a source of knowledge about how this stuff works. Because in movements that are calling for educational justice, let's say, or resource distribution, equality, liberation, they have to make demands for policy changes, and they have to target certain officials who are responsible for making those changes. And a lot of times it's just almost impossible to figure out how they work and who's in charge. So I found, a little niche for myself in being a kind of like a socialist, leftist policy researcher when it came to school finance. And it's been a really rewarding experience to kind of mobilize this framework and help struggles that are going on the ground. For instance, just at our university, we had a huge problem with affordable housing on campus, and there was a student movement that went out to address it. And I was able to look into some municipal bond statements to understand the history of this, and contribute to the conversation. Yeah, that would be my response there.
Yes.
For me, for the second question, I am very quickly, because in Italy it is impossible to find Marxian studies in university. It's simply impossible. And I think that it is an interesting point, because until the 90s, Italy was the vanguard of Marxist studies. After that, after 90s, everything died. And today it is the vanguard of liberalism in education. Perhaps because of rejection of the past tradition, I don't know. But there are some postgraduate courses in the university. I personally collaborate with a course. I paste on the chat the website of the course, and I suppose that is the only Marxist course in Italy today.
Yes, Roberto, you can ask a question.
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of riffing on Althusser's questionnaire that I cited in the talk, and just hearing you all speak, it reminds me that we are all teachers or researchers working in universities, one respect or the other, and I just wanted to know, maybe from each of you, what is your experience of being Marxists in the university in your different contexts? Like, what do you consider to be the salient aspects of your activities that align with your self-identity as a Marxist? Is it something that plays a role in how you approach teaching? Is it something that plays a role in how you approach, the marketization of the university, the fact that you have managers, the fact that you're exploited? Or is it something that you kind of compartmentalize in your approach to your professional responsibilities? I'd be interested to know what you think.
Roberto, David, Giacomo, your responses to that question?
I teach philosophy of mind, so I don't pose the problem. But the course I was talking about is where the group in which I work is the place where we can speak about Marxism and so on.
Well,
Me, oh no, you go, Panagiotis.
no, you go. I was just going to pass the floor to you.
Oh, okay. I was going to talk a little bit about the milieu, the terrain right now in the United States, at least. And I can't necessarily speak to Europe, although I would have to imagine it's something similar, although in the US we have our particular brand of toxicity. There is a ascendant, insurgent, virulent right wing in the United States right now. And they, through a combination of avarice and incompetence, have landed on education as their main central plank for domestic policy. And I think that's just because there's so many divisions on the right wing that they can't talk about anything else without fundamentally disagreeing with one another. But in any case, it's made being in education, specifically public education, in places where there are, large amounts of the repressive apparatus that are kind of controlled by the right wing, like at the state level and the local level. It's made it quite a fraught experience. Whereas before, I think there was a sense, when we were still at the end of history, so to speak, when we were still deep in the neoliberal consensus, the neoliberals, what did Milton Friedman say in Capitalism and Freedom? He's like, the benefit of capitalism is that the socialists can sell their books and talk, and that's fine. That's fine for them. And I think that there was that sort of sense of just like, you do this, you say it, fine. As long as you don't have any kind of material power. And now that's not okay, because I think that the sort of neoconservative aspect of that movement has been supercharged by the election of Trump and the various crises and their echoes throughout the social formation. So, whereas before, one could say this or that about Marxism, it's not, I don't feel personally safe doing it, frankly. But I'm still me in the classroom. And so, and I teach another thing about, I think, my pivot to thinking about school finance was a way of perhaps engaging in a language that is the language of material power in terms of finance, but also being able to discuss these questions of finance using, you know, the leftist and the socialist traditions, you know, including Marx, but not exclusively, was sort of a way in which to pivot. But, you know, using the title of your article, like the difficulty, there's a certain kind of material difficulty right now in really, I mean, in kind of talking about anything in education in the US. It's a very fraught moment.
Thanks a lot, David. Well, I think your last point is really crucial. It's about the difficulty of being a Marxist in education, because I mean, Roberto is right. We are at a period where we have strong movements in education. British case is one, the US case is another. France gives an example. Greece has had a highly original, let's say, quasi-social explosion recently. It came as a reaction to a train crash that was basically a neoliberal crime. But yeah, so yeah, this means that people have more open ears to listen about how to do things differently, but it requires a certain effort from the part of people that you know, proclaim to be Marxists. It demands that Marxism is not just a theoretical identity or a theoretical reference, that it becomes some kind of engagement. And I think that the importance of what we're discussing here, we're discussing Althusser, when we're discussing the debates around Althusser or the debates around education in the 1960s and 1970s, is that they were related to movements. People were thinking, okay, if I'm going to treat the university or school as an ideological state apparatus, I also have to think of an alternative. I also have to think how I can bring class struggle inside school. How can I open school? How can I transform the learning process? How can I organize a curriculum in a different way? How can I not only, let's say, improve proletarian access to education or higher education, but also transform higher education so that higher education is not the milieu of the reproduction of the division of labor. And if you look at the debates, they are always related to movements. If you see, for example, I have in mind always interventions, for example, by Poulanjas. Poulanjas would come to Greece and he would write articles exactly about about universities and education, or what needs to be changed, and be engaged in such debates. And if we also think that in relationship to other traditions, which I mean, they're not antagonistic, for example, let's say to the Althusserian example, for example, the Italian tradition of conricerza, I mean, the idea that you can have new forms of militant research, you know, at the side of movements, help movements understand better what is happening, and also, let's say, learn from movements. This is also something that is very, very relevant to such a conception of ideological state apparatus, because one of the things that we should never forget is that when Althusser refers to ideological state apparatus, this is never about simple reproduction. This is never simply a top-down process. This is not simply about the state sort of, projecting its discourse and ideology. It's about creating a material terrain, which is, to use a Poulanjian expression, a material condensation of forces. There is class struggle inside the ideological state apparatuses. Not only do they intervene in class struggle, they are traversed by class struggle. And we know very well how in the 1970s, for example, in articles, in texts such as the notes on the ideological apparatus of the state, Althusser would insist on this aspect, and this is an element, and he would always place great emphasis on movements. And I think, yeah, this calls for a kind of constant collective, let's say, self-criticism of our role as educators. For example, to constantly think, have I tried to, to what extent have I tried to change the form? To what extent have I opened up my core? To what extent have I, let's say, look a little bit outside the walls of academia, or the walls of school? And of course, you cannot say that you're a Marxist in academia and at the same time, succumb to the contemporary function of, let's say, this highly corporate version of higher education. We have this entrepreneurial conception. You have also to be part of the struggle, be part of movements against such. I mean, and if we were to discuss, for example, today, what aspects should be, added, that I use this word, to the problematic of Althusser, is how can we redefine the core notion of ideological apparatus of the state in an era of full commercialization, full privatization, full entrepreneurialization, where, in a certain way, full market exposure is the basic methodology of incorporating, internalizing the constraints of contemporary neoliberal politics and ideology. And I still think that that's a framework as the one that Althusser tried to articulate. It's still more than pertinent if we try to think and find ways to struggle and transform education, which, if I may say, however important it is today to defend public education, to defend the idea that schooling is a right, schools should be accessible, schools should be free of charge, free of tuition, etc., etc. At the same time, we also need to focus of what it means to have an educational system, let's say, for the people and to a certain extent by the people. Let's see if we have any other question. Let me check also the YouTube. The YouTube channel. No, I don't see anything. Anyway, so yep, I suggest, since we are slightly running out of time, if you want to say any concluding remarks, who wants to say something? Okay, so yeah, suggest that, with this note on struggle, because whatever we discussed today, in the end, it is about struggle inside education, struggle also outside education. And one of the things that I think that we tried to discuss today was exactly that Althusser was not just a philosopher. He was, in the last instance, always a communist in philosophy, someone trying to struggle, someone trying to think struggles in every aspect. And let's hope that the current wave of movements continues, and because this is the best conjuncture to discuss such questions. Again, I would like to thank all of you that were with us